And I was on mute. Hello, everyone. My name is Candace. I am the owner of Tubby Coos Mid-City Bookshop in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I am so happy to bring you this lovely queer event tonight. I am always happy to talk about queer sci-fi and fantasy because it's my most favorite thing in the whole entire world. And so I am so excited that that's what we're talking about here tonight. So welcome, welcome. And we are having a really good conversation between Zabé Ellor and K.D. Edwards, who are going to talk about representation of queer folks in epic fantasy. So I'm really excited about that. So we have first Zabé Ellor, who is the author of Silkfire, as well as May the Best Man Win, Acting the Part as well. Those are both YA contemporary novels, and also a graduate of Cornell University. He currently lives in Southern California. And we also have K.D. Edwards, who lives and writes in North Carolina, but has spent time in Massachusetts, Maine, Colorado, New Hampshire, Montana, and Washington, which does sound like a lot of snow in all of those places, which we're not used to here in New Orleans. But also, he has had short careers in food service, interactive television, corporate banking, retail management, and bariatric furniture, and a much less short career in higher education. So I'm really excited to have both of these authors today. Hello to both of you. And before I go, I want to make sure that everyone knows that we have a no harassment policy here. So anything that we think is harassment, we will kick you out if you're doing it. So just be nice to everyone. And also buy books, because that's what we're here for. And if you're going to buy them, we hope that you buy them from us, Tubby Coos Mid-City Bookshop in New Orleans. And at the end, I will post the links and all of that to my books. So welcome. Thank you all so much. And I will let you have your conversation that I'm very excited to listen to.
Well, thank you so much for hosting, Candace. Tubby Coos is a great shop. I love to work with LGBTQ inclusive bookstores. And K.D., I know we have a couple of questions to go over, but we can just really go back and forth and just see where the conversation takes us. I think the first question I have here is, what was the first time you saw an LGBTQ character in a fantasy novel, and what was the impact on you?
Should I go for yes?
Go for it, yeah.
So yes, you've lobbed it at me. I've been thinking about that question since I've seen it. I am so much more of a visual person, so I reflect more on like TV and games, and thinking of books. I can think of nothing from my childhood. Nothing. Like, I'm sure there was something, but it is barren. There was nothing in my schooling. I mean, I'm in my 50s now, early 50s, just early 50s, barely early 50s. But it wasn't until I was probably in my 20s and on my own, out by that point, and comfortable going into a bookstore and looking at whatever I wanted on the shelf without thinking my town had the cameras like on me from behind. And it was almost exclusively in fantasy. I started to see the emergence largely from woman authors. Like, I'm thinking Mercedes Lackey, the Night Runner theory, Lynn Llewellyn. Those were my first influences, and I gotta say they were pretty good ones too. They were pretty amazing. But it's comparing back then and now is there is no comparison. It's literally apples and oranges. You can't even talk about how different things are, beginning and ending with me sobbing last night watching Last of Us. So this is just a different world creatively, literature, movies, television, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I think for me the example that always comes to mind is, I think about Magnus Bane in Cassandra Clare's Mortal Instruments trilogy. And I was about 16 when I remember very clearly, I was 16. It was sophomore year, between summer somewhere after my sophomore year of high school, and I was at the beach, and I was just walking around. I'd gone into a little bookstore, and there was this book that had a Stephanie Meyer blurb on the cover. And I was a twihard, so I was like, oh, Stephanie Meyer likes this. I will probably like this too. And so I'm just reading this fantasy novel, and then suddenly out of nowhere, you have this openly bisexual warlock who just parades in, and not only is he queer, but he's queer in a way that I had no access to growing up, because there had the only real access I'd had to queer people at the time was, God, what year was it? It was I think it was about 2010. And so I think right then politically the queer community was very focused on being conventional, and there was a lot of pressure to advocating for gay marriage, advocating for a very, I don't want to say whitewashed, but a very respectable image of queerness. And so the queer people in platforms was, we have couples, we have people who want to start families. And so there was very much a focus, I think, in media on presenting queerness as sanitized. And then suddenly to encounter a character who is flamboyantly queer, who expresses this by throwing loud, raucous parties and wearing, silk dressing gowns and being very effeminate, and having that be a position of power.
Yeah.
Power from their ability to be gender nonconforming and queer and open and defiant about it. It was such an eye-opening experience for me, because I'd never realized that queerness was not just only about sexuality, but it was had this deeper relationship to gender and power in society. And I think that's something that really carried through when I was writing Silk Fire.
Yeah, that's a great example about the fact that it's not just the fact that representation increased, but in a meaningful way with meaningful pivotal characters. Right? The characters who were powerful, who, leapt off the page, who stole the scenes. That was just such, when I was young too, even it wasn't just that representation was so small, the storylines were so small. I mean, AIDS or coming out. And then if you wanted to go beyond that, some sort of violence perpetuated because of your identity. I mean, those were you had to start there, and there wasn't anything beyond that. There was, I think, to be honest, even when I started writing back, planning my series about 10 years ago, there still wasn't that series based around LGBT plus concerns, where the main characters were about it, where the fact that they were identifying on the queer spectrum was not even part of the storyline. That was just part of their development as a character, but it didn't tie into the novel. I think that was one of the reasons I even kind of set about doing what I did, because I'd fallen in love with the urban fantasy genre so hard. To the point where you look at my first novel, and some of it's derivative to just the common urban fantasy tropes, because I lived, breathed urban fantasy at that time. Everything about it tied into stuff I loved from a kid. Even the idea of Superman, Superman is an urban fantasy. You take the world as you know it and you add in a supernatural element. But I wanted to see those stories I loved. I wanted to see them told from a different perspective, my perspective. I wanted to see myself in the mirror, and that was just the beginning of my learning. I thought I was advanced in my appreciation of diversity at that point, and my readers quickly disabused me and opened the door to even worlds I hadn't even begun to glimpse, and I've never looked back. It's just been, the experience of a lifetime.
I think that's one of my favorite things with urban fantasy and in contemporary fantasy, is how it can open windows on the present. I think that was something I was really conscious of when writing Silk Fire. This is a fantasy that takes place in a city, and it's not, our world, but it's not some sort of world that is in how we would imagine the past, and it's futuristic in so many ways. This is a world that has had technology for thousands and thousands of years, and in the remnants of these ancient civilizations, they find computers and communications technology that has just been part of this world for centuries. And I think there's something really fun about that, because I think a lot of fantasy kind of takes place in the past or some imagined version of it. And, it's harder to see. It's not impossible. I mean, there's a lot of good books that have done it, but in some ways, it's trickier to see queerness in the past, or at least see our modern relationships to queerness in the past. And I think that's something that can be very freeing about writing fantasy in a more contemporary, more technology-driven setting, is that we can really explore our own lives and our experiences without that extra layer of distance.
Agree completely.
So what we're and I think, and your books, while they take place in an urban fantasy setting, you also have this world of Atlantis, this wonderful city, and you've put so much thought and world building into that. So what are some of the things you thought about when building this world with so many wonderful queer characters? Were there any special considerations that you had in mind?
Well, to be honest, I think my learning curve happened after my first book came out. I look back and I saw, I was really proud of myself for, this is a story I wanted to tell, and I told it. But afterwards, I saw that my vision of diversity was so narrow, even within the queer community, and the sheer breadth of it, and the diversity there. When those readers started reaching out to me and saying, "I really love your story. I love that you never see the words gay or straight, but I'd love to see more of myself in the series." I took that as a challenge and an opportunity. I always have. I mean, I've read some writers who don't think it's not organic to their process to add things in based upon that sort of reader feedback. Completely the opposite with me. If anything, every now and then I say my world building is crowdsourced, because as much as I've built my world, I always keep the door open for readers to contribute parts of it as well and tell me what would be important to them. And if I hadn't listened to readers, I would have missed out on adding strong women to my story in particular, exploring the parts of the queer community that weren't my own past and my own experiences, especially gender fluidity, transgendered characters. I'm just beginning with that. I'm really listening to what's out there to my readers and telling a story I want to tell, but also just making it richer and making more people feel they're invested in it. So, the world building I did around queer issues, that's evolved from the beginning. Like, to be honest, I think I wish I could go back in time and make it a little bit stronger from the beginning. The world building itself is something, yes, I've worked on that for 10 years. From the craft of a writer, the techniques of a writer, the one thing I recommend to people, if you're interested in doing really deep world building, I mean, really think of ways that you can talk about your world in such a way that it makes it accessible, a little bit alien, is just pay attention to everything in your day-to-day life. Everything you do. You're in line at the bank, you go to an ATM machine, you find a dime on the street corner. Every single thing, try to put that through the lens of what your world would be like. Would there be a dime on a sidewalk? Do they even have coins? What are banks like? Are there lines? Or is it a survival of the fittest at the grocery store with who gets to check out next? There's so much opportunity to be creative there, and all you need to do is just watch around you and take the world as you know it, and then just apply your own filter over it.
Yeah, it's so funny. One of my favorite scenes in Silkfire is where Corey, the main character, he goes to. I think it's like I call it the fantasy Whole Foods, the Jadzean Whole Foods, the Whole Food. The world of my book is called Jadzia, and so he's he's been working he's 22 years old. He's been working as a sex worker for several years, kind of in a rundown portion of town. He has this chance meeting with a noblewoman who's one of his relatives, and she's like, "Oh, I'm going to pull you out of this terrible squalor you're living in." And suddenly he's living with her, and he has to figure out, okay, like, I need to cook a meal to show my aunt that I'm grateful for her to taking me in. And then he goes out to get ingredients to make food, and he's like, oh my God, this is like the fanciest, most upscale marketplace I've ever been to, and I have no idea what to buy. I have no idea what's good. I don't even know how to cook. So it's very aspirational of him, but I think those are some of my favorite things to write. I really love writing a good scene where a character goes shopping, and that's a really great way to learn about the world, just from seeing the goods and services that they're buying. I totally agree with you with adding with writing diversity and with exploring identities. I think one thing I really wish that I had done in my book is, and this was partially a space issue, because I was, very much constrained when I was writing this to one single book, and 120,000 words. And so it was like I was really struggling to get all of the story I had in mind for this one character on the page. And I had so many like plot lines that I wanted to write that got cut, or that got shuffled off to a sequel, that might never happen. I really wanted to explore, okay, so, and because a lot of the book centers around the conflict between the people of the war district and the people of the engineering district, which are these two neighborhoods that have these different philosophies, these different histories. And the war district has a history of trying to colonize and oppress and exploit the engineering district, and the engineers have their own history of fighting back and resisting that. And so a lot of the book is taken up with the conflict between these two societies. And I really wanted to explore, there's so many other different societies in this world. There's different levels within these societies. There's divisions there, there's stratification there. It's a heavily gendered society. So it's a matriarchal society. And in the war district, that manifests in a very toxic and cruel and dangerous way, that I think Corey, working as a sex worker, really experiences kind of the worst of that society, or he experiences it in a very dangerous and exaggerated way that most people wouldn't. But I really wish I had the space to explore, okay, what does this look like in the engineering district, which is a more equitable society? What does it look like in these other places that aren't even mentioned, that are still this matriarchal society, but have a much more benevolent approach to running this system?
Yeah, when
So,
doing I have so much more latitude doing a series because I'm only 3 books into what has from the very beginning been a 9-book arc, and each novel has its own kind of like distinct theme. Not even just what the story is, but I have my catastrophic weather event novel. I've got my big terrible monster novel, and whenever an idea hits me, or a bit of brainstorming, especially something I can't fit into my current project, which absolutely happened in a big way with book 3, there's a home for it. I could put it somewhere else. The trick is usually just figuring out what's interesting in your head and what's going to be interesting to the reader. Most writers will tell you, 10% of your brainstorming of what your city is like is going to make it on the page. You need to know that other 90%, but the reader doesn't. What are the really interesting things which are going to set up the rules of the world for a reader but not bore them at the same time as exposition? That's the balance of what I pay a lot of attention to, that because I do have a lot of exposition in my novels. I have to explain things, and I want to do it in such a way that I think there's an author, I think his name is Harry Connolly. I think he did the 20 Palaces Urban Fantasy once upon a time. And I remember he was writing a fantasy series, and he called it, his name for it was Epic Fantasy with No Boring Parts. And I've never forgotten that, because I always think about whenever I'm writing a novel, like, do I have any boring bits? Anywhere from page 1 to page 300. Is there a boring bit in there? What can I do to make it a little bit more interesting? But the world building for me is one of the biggest challenges. I'm interested, I had talked about my influences when I expand the scope of diversity in my writing. What's your influences? Like, when you look at what you did and you think in a future project, I want to add more representation or things of that nature, where are you getting that feedback from, that you internalize and then put into your writing?
I think for me, it's really, it's something that, well, I mean, you'd be like, oh, angry Twitter posts. But I think it's mostly just from the queer communities that I'm part of. And, I'm very lucky. I live out in LA. I'm part of a very diverse queer community here, and kind of every group has their own unique experiences of queerness, kind of how that intersects with their other identities. And so I think in Silkfire, Corey and his queerness are very much at odds with his society, and the society he grew up in is very toxic, and he doesn't want to be part of that, and kind of how they handle gender and queerness is part of that choice. But then, you know, we have characters like Faziz, who he's an immigrant. I describe him as an immigrant at different points in the novel, and so we have these different communities living in this world that are immigrant communities, and they have strong bonds within these communities that are a source of protection and support. And so his relationship to his community is going to be different than Kore's relationship to his community and the people that he grew up around, because they have this shared history that is very meaningful to them. And that was one of the things that I had to cut, that I really do wish that I could have kept in. And I have like, I have several short stories and bonus chapters that I've posted to my Tumblr that kind of go into that more. But yeah, you know, it's so important when you're writing epic fantasy and you're dealing with, you know, I've never really like, I love the boring parts of it. Like, give me your feast scenes, like give me your long descriptions of what everyone is eating. You know, like give me your long books where everyone is traveling. Like give me those chapters where they're on the road. And I love all that. I will read that for ages.
There's and I know that we're going to post the questions later, but there's one at the bottom now, which is actually really, it's exactly what we're talking about right now. Like something beyond your own experience. How do you address it? For me, and I think that was one of the reasons why I didn't go as far as I could in my first book. I mean, when I was younger, I worked in diversity consulting. It was a huge part of my early career, but what was diversity consulting in the 1990s is nothing like it is today. I mean, we were at that point, it was all about say firefighter and say a fireman, police officer instead of policeman. It was very basic on the days of diversity and more inclusive language. But I think to a certain extent, I was scared in my first novel to address more beyond me. I thought if I get it wrong, it's inappropriate. I don't want to appropriate other people's story. And I still struggle with that to this day, but my readers made me more brave, not because they believed that, well, maybe they did believe I could tell the story, right? But they liked my story and they wanted to see more of themselves in it. And that was when I started asking questions and expanding my circle of friends and beta readers. Beta readers are huge when it comes to stuff like this. You hear the phrase diversity readers or diversity consultants when it comes to, you know, running it past people very specialized in giving you diversity feedback before you publish. But even just finding people who've lived that story and getting them to read and finding out where you've misstepped. I think like one of my current opportunities is bringing a character with a pronounced disability into the story. I had one character, and I did a really extensive amount of research on just that that individual situation, but bringing in a character who's really, that's going to be their life story and experience. I anticipate that I'll be working with a lot of sensitivity readers on that, not just because I don't want to offend people, but it's so important for me to get it right because I'm introducing a character I love. I really want it to succeed, but I really do. I think I'm a little bit more courageous about going beyond my gender, my race, my own disability or abilities, and I couldn't do it without my readers. I just simply couldn't.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think for me, so yeah, this is something that like I've thought a lot about and has always been part of my writing. It's something I go back and forth on. So I started writing Silkfire before I had transitioned, before I was even out as trans, and I felt an enormous amount of pressure to write from a female POV because I'm like, oh, I don't want to like appropriate queer male experiences, but also writing from a female POV was very distressing for me at the time, and so I think it wasn't until 2019 that I actually felt comfortable writing from a female POV. And
do you think that pressure still exists for you?
I think for me, it was a dysphoria thing. And I think as I was more comfortable in myself in my relationship to my gender, I felt more comfortable writing female characters. But that is why we don't have a female character's POV in this book. It's just because I was not in a head state where I felt comfortable writing that. And then kind of as I've become more comfortable, you know, I have that material, and it's really interesting to me. But yeah, I think especially for writing outside my experiences, you know, especially with writing people of different ethnicities, you know, it's tricky in science fiction and fantasy, because if I'm like, so for a character like Rhea, like she is heavily coded as Indian. And so, you know, she's from a nation that has experienced waves of colonization, and has kind of built this strong industrialized society around kind of resisting and pushing back against that movement. And so, you know, just in her physical description, and, you know, when I talk about some of the cuisine that is served in this country, so that coding is there. But also this is, you know, a world that is kind of, you know, set in like a far future where the influences are there, but it would feel tricky going up to a person and saying, oh, you know, can you give me some insight onto how this character might feel? And, you know, they're not from, you know, they're not from your culture. But there's some similarities, but also there's like all this difference. You know, can you tell me how this person would feel, you know, because you have, you know, some superficial similarities, when like you know, this is a culture that has different values, and this is a culture that has different religion, and a culture that has different history. And that's kind of a tricky thing when you're writing fantasy, and when it's like, okay, there might be some connection. So it is tricky, and I did have some really good beta readers on this book who were able to kind of give me their perspective on some of the issues. But I do think at the end of the day, you know, especially when you're writing other worlds, there's kind of a gap between what sensitivity readers can say about a culture that is made up and just isn't theirs. So I think it's a really good thing to do is to read up on common tropes and to know, okay, what are the most
great advice.
Yeah, what are the tropes that are kind of used against people the most? You know, what can you do? What do people find the most harmful? Reading up on scholarship, so I read a lot of bell hooks when I was just like, okay, how do I write a Black character in a story? And I took a class on American Indian history when I was reading up on, okay, how do I write a Native character in my work? And so I think taking on that responsibility to educate yourself and to be aware of the history of how different groups have been represented, and then, you know, understanding that there's going to be, that, you know, some people are just not going to connect with how you portray something, and just being okay with, you know, you do have to be okay with, like, this is like your representation of any experience is not going to be anyone else's representation, or it's not going to be perfect everyone's experience as well.
That's a really good point too. You're never gonna, you're right. There's no universal answer to this. Some people will agree with your approach and some people won't. I shoot for the majority of my readers. One of the things I tell people a lot, I do read all my reviews. That's the one thing I've always committed to as an author. I read all my reviews, and I say quite often the ones I pay attention to the most are when they give you a good star, you know, the 3 to 4 or 5 stars, and they say, I really like this story, but ... They cared enough to write it and give you a relatively decent review, but they're also caring enough to tell you where they think it could be improved. I've learned so much from reading those reviews, to the point where I wish I hadn't told people I read them, because now I'll be reading your review and they'll say, oh my God, I hear the author reads reviews. I hope that he does not mention this. But that's for me, that's a great source of feedback as well. And I do imagine that, what's the 60, 20, 20, what's that middle group of people that you really can maybe move the needle for how they think about the world, or else you can really describe the way that they experience the world. You can really do something there. And then there are some people who it's just going to be outside their realm of experience, or it's so deeply their experience, there's an issue with them maybe in reading it from someone else's perspective. And then there are some people who will follow you regardless because they've been there from the beginning. But I do shoot for the largest slice of representation I can. That's important to me. I set about doing this because I felt some of mainstream urban fantasy was lacking diversity. It was lacking my view. So it would be arrogant of me just to put my view in and no one else's, because the whole point of this was to expand representation from my perspective. So I just made it one of my mottos, my rule of thumbs when I write something.
Yeah, and I think I think that's great, and I think that really dovetails well into kind of our next question is, what do you find personally meaningful in writing LGBTQ fantasy?
Never saying the words, never. I'm getting very a little bit too rigid in my definitions when I say don't ever use the words gay or straight. That's just a little bit too binary there. But that's my essential intent. It's never about your own sexual identity. That's just part of the character. I want the stories to be mainstream urban fantasy, big blockbuster, fun, comedy, found family. I want all those elements that I love the most in these stories with just characters who happen to be in the queer community. That, for me, that's my target. That's what I'm shooting for.
I think it's so funny because I think one of the things that I've had people respond to and Silkfire is why do you have characters say words like bisexual or lesbian? What are these words doing in this world? And it's well, they're not actually saying this exact word. There's a word in the language of this world that they're saying, and then kind of I as author am translating it into English, and so this word we're using would translate as lesbian or translate as bisexual. But it's so fun. I think for me, I think when I'm writing, I always I find these little threads of ideas and I poke at them and I get an idea and I want to kind of follow it and see where it goes. And I think when I was writing Silkfire, what was really on my mind was it was 2017. It was right after the election of Donald Trump. And so I'd had this idea in my head where it's okay, I want to write this book about a sex worker. I want to write about him being involved in a political situation where he has to kind of use his skills at seduction and looking hot in order to achieve his goals. And then kind of from there, I decided that this was going to be a matriarchal world when I decided that this was a world in which every human just is born with the ability to control their fertility. So it's you can't get pregnant, or not every human. But if you have a uterus, you can just control with your mind whether or not you can get pregnant. And that was just because I wanted to have magical birth control in this story. Yeah, and so then when I started the world building, I'm okay, so we're going to have a matriarchal society because this is a world where right from the start, it's women who have been making all the decisions about how everything will go in their families. Sorry, do you have something to say, K.D.?
Oh, I mean, more along those lines. The thing, what's important to me as an author, especially with regards to the series, definitely the representation was huge. I think, and to talk a little bit more about my series in particular, sometimes I shy away. I just finished one trilogy. I'm starting my next, and I learned my lesson about revealing a little bit too much in advance. My readers pay attention. One of the things I learned is if I tell one person one thing, there's a very good chance a lot of people will find out. So I got to be careful that I'm not giving away too much. But I wanted to write something with high rereadability. That was important to me. For the most of my life, I read really serious fiction, and I reached a point where the world was serious fiction. I didn't need more serious fiction in my life. Um, so I wanted something escapism, but I wanted it to be meaningful. And usually this more happens with me on television than it does books. But I remember for a book as a good example, Sarah Reese Brennan, in Other Lands,
Oh, that's a
was
great book.
a good book. Halfway through it, I stopped, went back to the beginning to reread it because it was going too fast, and it was so good. I just did not want it to end. I wanted to write a book like that. Same thing with TV. Like one of my favorite shows right now is Superman and Lois, and it's about to start the third season. Just love that show. It's for some reason it hits a nostalgia for me, but it's the right kind of nostalgia. It's very there's so much nostalgia in my life from when I was younger that's not right. That this is something that just feels I like it a lot. And not only when a new episode would come out, not only do I watch it, I watched the last two episodes that just happened again. It's because I love it that much. And that's what I wanted to give my readers. And because I wanted to do something, a series where people could pick it up and reread it again and feel like they're going back to friends and families and they're picking up something new. And because I knew where I wanted to go for 9 novels, that's when I doubled down on that and said, well, I'm also going to put a lot of Easter eggs in. I'm going to put a lot of breadcrumbs. There are things I'm going to hint about from the first book that might not even show up until 3, 4, 5 books down the road, but you will be able to go back to that first book if you're so inclined, and you will see that I blatantly told you right then and there that there was something that was going to surprise you down the road. And it's a 9-book series in 3 trilogies. For those of you who don't know me, I probably should have talked a little bit more about that, but it reimagines a modern day world with Atlantis in it. And Atlantis is now a refugee culture. They've taken over the island of Nantucket and built the city of New Atlantis after their homeland was destroyed during a war between Atlanteans and human when they came out to the world and revealed themselves in the 1960s. And it takes place in the modern time. But I knew exactly where I wanted to go for these 3 story arcs, 3 trilogies. So the first trilogy is done, and I have a sort of a hybrid novel coming out at the end of this month. It's something I'm really proud about because it's not traditional publishing. I've got this beautiful hardcover limited edition that Rainbow Crate did, a subscription book service. I mean, really beautiful hardcover. And Audible offered a contract for a novella for an Audible version with my narrator, Josh Earley, and I'm going to own the ebook rights. So that'll be my personal ownership. And the Eidolon is sort of a 200-page continuation, I'd say, of book 3. Whatever it started out as, it really did wind up as a 200-page expansion of the story for book 3. And it also set up the events for book 4, 5, and 6. And the one thing I can say about it, and to talk about my style of writing and what's important to me, if people who really like my stuff and are willing to reread it, I drop one of my biggest serious bombs, I think, in the novella that is the exact example of what I'm talking about from the beginning of my first book 3 books ago. I was building up to certain things, and when I finally get to reveal it to the reader, I want them to go back and look and say, holy crap, he just basically gave that away in book 2, just outright said that was going to happen and buried it in such a way that we didn't pay attention to. Nothing gives me greater pleasure than to constantly upend readers' expectations, but not in a way that doesn't feel like I'm creating a plot that doesn't exist. In it more that I'm finally revealing something that you go back and you're like, oh, okay, I see what you were doing.
Yeah, I think that's so, I think it's one of the greatest compliments a reader ever gave me was they said that they had to read the book twice to really get it. And I'm like, yes, that's what I want you to do. I want you to read it twice. Because there's so much density in there. And I think at first it's like, there's kind of this like surface level story of Corey and his romance and self-discovery and like dealing with all this trauma that he's built up over the course of a lifetime. But there's also this kind of wider political arc that is about how gender and politics interact and kind of some of the superficialities, but also the really deep effects that gender has on how we interact with the political. And it's like, that's what I want readers to do. It's, read it once for the story, and then kind of like go back, and there's all these little details and in the banquet scenes, in the sex scenes, in the little conversations. I had one reader like come to me once and said, "Oh, I thought it was so strange that Corey is always apologizing in his conversations. He almost has this tick where he starts off every conversation with, 'I'm sorry, but,'" and then they were like, "Oh, I realized that's kind of like him reacting to people who have never taken him seriously."
Mm.
And you have a character like Rhea, who's a woman who's grown up in this world, and she's just always used to being treated with respect and acclaim. And so if she's apologizing for something, that's because she knows it's necessary. There's just little ticks like how the characters talk is one of my favorite things to write.
I mean, it is a joy when readers go back and reread something you wrote, because the amount of time you put into it and your love, I mean, this is your baby, and you want people to see the different things that they might have missed the first time around. But at the same point, there is no huger compliment from a reader when they reread your book. I can't, as an author, I barely can comprehend that. I know how limited my time is. I know how rarely I reread and what I reread and why and what it means to me. To know that I might be one of those books for people, that they reread it because it brings them peace or the right sort of escape, or it gives them maybe a little bit more courage to go into their own day, gives me courage to go in my own day when I'm writing these characters. There's no value you can put on a comment like that. It to this day, whenever I see people mention going back to my series a second or third time, whatever it might be, I acknowledge from a sense of humility that that's beyond anything I dreamed of as a writer. It's a huge compliment. My readers are a huge part of what I do, and I never forget that. They're part of this experience. When I first started out as a writer, I never thought that would be. I thought that you put your book out there, and then you're terrified for that book, and then people react to it. What I didn't think is how much I'd come to love my readers and how much they're a part in every day when I sit down to write. I'm thinking about them. Eidolon, this novella I'm doing, I just finished it in December. Because this is hybrid publishing, it's coming back from the printers. In fact, I just get a note saying the hardcovers are coming back. I wouldn't be surprised within 2 weeks if people have the hardcover in their hand. And I mean, my readers, they're everything. I mean, everything centers around them. This whole experience I have with their reactions and what they want and what they like and what they want to know more about. It's a driving force in my life.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think it's tricky. I'm definitely newer in my career, and I'm still kind of building my readership in fantasy. But just those. So if you're lurking and you've read my book, it's cool to tell me. It's like cool to like post on socials and tag me and say, "Hey, I liked this." But it can be such a lonely thing, and I think it's tough because as much as you want to just unplug and just let what happens with the book happen, I think especially in this world where you as a writer have to run all of your own publicity, and where you have to be just, and when you're on the same social media that everyone else is, it's very easy to just see the worst things or pick up on the worst vibes. And it's so meaningful when readers share what they liked about a book, and it's very encouraging.
Yeah, feedback is always a gift. And I remember when I first heard that phrase. I'm in human resources too. I've been doing human resources for decades. So that I finally understood that phrase, feedback is a gift. It's because people avoid confrontation. No one really wants to give granted, internet's a little bit different when you're behind an anonymous login, but for the most part when you're talking with people, no one really likes to criticize or give feedback or say something that might hurt people's feelings. Anyone who really gives you constructive feedback, it's a gift that they took the time to do that and found the strength to do it, and hoping that it would be received well. So I take that as the gift it's worth. I see that, the value of that.
Oh, and I think if anyone's got questions, that would be a great time to drop them in the chat. I think we've got one here from Faye Lewis. Yes, why do you think Poppy Zebright doesn't get as much recognition for her work?
Yeah, I think it's the horror genre. It's the subgenre. That's a really niche story. That's strong horror too. There could be some really explicit stuff there. Brilliant author, fantastic books, but I do think it probably is the horror angle. It's funny how many of those subgenres out there from the beginning were definitely much more queer friendly than other subgenres. But
I think it's interesting because horror, I think there's a tendency of genres, especially small genres, like epic fantasy or like horror, to get crowded out by a few main names. And so, like, if you've got Stephen King, his books already take up 50% of the horror shelf, and then you've got a couple more names, and they take up the other 50%. And it's hard. I think, in writing epic fantasy is tricky because you're competing with, Tolkien and Jordan. You're competing with a lot of people who have passed on for space on the shelves. You're competing with a lot of people who have established series, established relationships with publishers, and so and it's not like like George R. R. Martin. He's my competition right there. But it's tricky because it doesn't seem like there's a lot of there can be not enough space. And I know, K.D, we've talked about this a bit, but also, in urban fantasy, there was a big thing in publishing where it's like, oh, we have too much urban fantasy. We got too much of it. And now there's just not going to be any of it for a while. But yeah, it definitely, it's hard to break into a genre, and it's hard to get recognition in a genre when it's kind of, when there isn't really like an appetite in the industry kind of for new voices at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and we've got a second question from Kay. K.D, do you have anything more to add to that one?
No. I'm looking at the new question. It's a great question.
Yes. I think I already talked about this, and we've got a second one from Kay. There's been discussion about what good representation means, some arguing the definition is too sanitized. What does representation, good and bad, mean to you?
That's a fantastic question. I'm sorry, you go first, Zabé.
So there was a short story, Short Changes Over Long Periods of Time by Kame Sparza. It's about a trans guy who is bitten by a vampire. He's turning into a vampire, and it's wreaking havoc on his trans body. And he's kind of dealing with that. And I remember the first time I read it was before I started on testosterone. And so it was like the first account I had ever read by another trans person about what that experience was like. And it was horrifying because it was a horror story. And it was very like, it was very shocking and frightening. And I just remember being like, oh, this sounds like the most extreme, like terrifying thing in the world. And of course I, went through it, and it wasn't that bad. So I think especially with, I'm not gonna speak for everyone, but I think especially for trans people, we can be very careful about what we see as good representation or bad representation, because our experiences are so diverse, and the way we see our gender is so different from one another, that anything, especially when we're still figuring out our identities, anything that is different or off, or that isn't like, that's not the language I'd use, or that's not quite the way I feel it, it can feel threatening or invalidating. So I think for me, I don't really phrase things in terms of like good representation or bad representation. I say, there's representation, and there's certain pieces of representation that are particularly meaningful to me. But unless something is going into like an area where it's like, okay, that is just stereotypical, like that is just a stereotype, like that is just a harmful stereotype, I'm very hesitant these days to label something at least from my own experience, as bad representation, because I know there's so much variation within that category.
Yeah, the only thing I can really talk about here, well, I could talk about anything. I could talk about other people all day long, but from my own personal experience, yeah, there's such a thing as good and bad representation in my own writing. Just because I had women in my first novel doesn't mean it was good representation. I really am a little bit embarrassed in my first novel. If I could go back and rewrite parts of it, I fidget with stuff, and I'm beginning to realize the thing I've been fidgeting with is literally a whole thing of push pins. Probably not the best thing to be pushing into the palm of your hand, but when it comes to representation, I botched my first one. Every woman I had on the page, there was something, I mean, really something that almost offensive, whether mention of an eating disorder, looks. I mean, I learned a lot, not just from that, but when the pandemic started, I really shifted from books to television, and international television, and I really saw different examples out there of how different countries treat gender issues, and it opened my eyes on so much stuff. I don't think it's appropriate necessarily for me to say that I'm a feminist. It always feels weird to say that, but I am one hell of an ally now. I've really, really, that's something I prioritize in anything I watch, recommend, review, and it's because there is a good representation and bad. It's, you want to know the difference between a trope and a stereotype. Stereotypes can be harmful, and more important though, it's that own voices thing. I'm not saying that you should not include representation if it's not your own voice. I actually disagree with that statement, because there's great literature out there that wouldn't exist if that were true. However, what that story is about, yeah, own voices does play into it. I have a character called Lane who is gender fluid. That's not my experience. It's becoming my journey because I have some people very close to me in my life who are in that journey, and I'm learning a lot. And I'm so glad I created the character of Lane, my first character, where I really focus on pronoun use, they, them. But I get some criticism because very rarely do I put Lane front in the center of the story. They tend to be a side character, or not appear too much in the main story. And part of that's because I don't feel it's my journey. I don't necessarily know that if it's fair for me to write about Lane's experiences and what they're going through. So I do think that there is a balance there between how far you should go in telling a story if it's not your own experience, because that could blow up in your face and it could hurt people, and it could waste a lot of what otherwise might be a great story or time by, I mean, just, an ill-advised effort. But at the same point, you should never be scared about representation. I do, the representation needs to happen. That's the first step in any journey to a better society. So it's a first step for people respecting groups that are different from them, that they don't know about, not being scared about it. Just having that out there is the first step. 20 years back, you look back at representation and what it looked like in the 1990s, before Ellen and the puppy dog episode. Just having the gay best friend was considered enough. And, we learned that representation does need to evolve over time, but it's a first step. It's a start. I kind of wandered on that question. I hope that I answered, K.A. I hope what you were asking.
Yeah, and I think that's so. I think it's so. There is never gonna be like a right. There's never gonna be a right answer. I really wish that I had included. Well, I don't really wish that. I wish that I'd been able to write a larger book and write my book within the context of the trilogy that I had planned. Unfortunately, sometimes publishing doesn't work out in the way you want it to work out. Because I do really wish that I had included more female POVs and had kind of explored more of how women exist in this matriarchal society. But I also really just stand by, I wanted to write a book exploring what queer masculinity would look like in a sort of society. And the gender expression that I write about in the novel is important, and it's one we don't have a lot of books about. And I do think we do have, I will say, I do think we do have more books in fantasy that explore what does it mean to be a woman and have a complicated relationship with power than what does it mean to be a very effeminate queer man and have that same journey, just because I think we as a society have a very negative relationship to queer men who are effeminate in any ways. So I think, and I'm also not too concerned with, especially because there's a lot of like women in the book who are, it's mostly like wealthy white women who are billionaires and trillionaires from these families of oligarchs that have like controlled these powerful armies for generations. It's I feel fairly comfortable exploring their misdeeds and misbehaviors, because I think that even when we talk, you can't really say like, oh, how do you represent women as a monolith, kind of, as opposed to you have to understand, oh, there's a lot of variations within any group you're representing, and the group is a monolith. Yeah, I think really good representation means representing people as human, and not necessarily like making a decision about like, is this person a good person or a bad person, but representing the fullness of people's humanity. I think
Faye has a question. Great question.
Yes, go for it.
In my case, not a zero, absolute zilch, to the point where I specifically talking about like the senior editor of my series, Renee Sears, who I love. I mean, just one of my favorite people in the world. In the beginning, I presumed that my representation would be an issue. Turned out not to be. Like, I would constantly defending my choices to write a story about, with a lot of queer characters, and I'd immediately launch into offense, think that Pyre wouldn't want to hear about it, they wouldn't want to emphasize it, they wouldn't want to build it obviously into the synopsis of the novel, not just so that it's a tag word in the Amazon searches, but it is obvious from reading the back of the novel what this novel's about. I assumed that it was going to be an issue, and it wasn't. Like, to the point where I remember the first novel came out, and a man who was reviewing it, a gay man who was reviewing it, said, "I wish you would have been clearer that there were gay characters in the story in the back of the novel." So I think you would have, I would have, from the beginning, I would have liked it a lot more, because there just wasn't as much out there back in that time. And I learned that I could go to my publisher and say, I would like the synopsis to be more geared towards LGBT plus. They did it. Didn't even ask questions. The next day, the synopsis was updated. So I am pleasantly able to say that I've largely had a positive experience with my publisher with regards to content. The only thing they've ever basically said is I had to cut my page count of my books due to cost of printing concerns. That's the one thing they've ever really pushed back on. It is nice to hear. It really, it's so funny that, especially if you're like an older American, you remember the days where diversity was, you were a strict minority and you had to go with that armor whenever you talked about the subject. You had to have the shield in your hands and be prepared to defend yourself. And things have changed. As much as the world is on fire right now, it's impossible to stress how much things have changed over time, in recent time too. There are problems, don't get me wrong, but the forward progress of diversity is moving forward, and I'm glad to say that, at least in my experience, publishing is there. My publisher is there.
I think it's interesting because I think publishers can be more accepting of queer books these days, but they'll take the books, but they don't always support them.
That's a reality. Well, I think a lot of books don't necessarily. Publishing is not the same. I don't think many authors get the publishing support they once did 20, 30 years ago. It's a very different experience as a writer nowadays.
I was talking to someone about like Brandon Sanderson the other day, and I was saying like the amount of support that guy got when he was starting out, no one would be granted that support. And that's another tricky thing about writing epic fantasy, because not only are you competing with, I always said like the thing I want to do is I want to like write a large fantasy universe, and I want to have the Jadzia, the Silkfire books be part of that. I want to write more books in this universe. I want to kind of bring everything together and kind of around these different themes and magic systems that I have in my head. And it's like, I don't think that that's something I'd be able to traditionally publish because there's just so much pressure to write standalones to pair stuff. I know writers who had pitched books as duologies, and those got cut down to standalones, and pitched trilogies that got cut down to
duologies were the new trilogies, and now standalones are the new duologies. That's outrageous, but it's true.
Yeah, I think that's something unique about Pyre, that you've been able to go to. I have never. If I went to any publisher with a 9-book series, I would be laughed out of the building.
It was, from what I hear, I was very fortunate. And it was Renee Sears, my editor, who fought for this. And all 9 books aren't under contract necessarily, but I will say the entire next trilogy is under contract, and that in itself was a huge sign of support from both Audible and Pyre, that things went well enough the first trilogy that they're really thinking ahead. Renee and I talk about book 9 all the time, so. That is an experience most people don't have, that you just walk in and say, I want to do a 9-book series. But I will say that also this is what I wanted to do. I didn't think about what would sell. I thought, where is my heart going to go? Where really could I see myself excelling and sticking with this and following it through to the end? And I'm glad I did that. I really did.
I think that's most important advice. For kind of anyone who's interested in writing book, you have to stick with your vision. You cannot let yourself get argued into making your book into diminishing your vision. And I think the big thing I've learned through publishing this book is don't let people gaslight you. Don't be talked out. Don't be talked into making yourself smaller, because there's plenty of people who want to do that for you, but know what your vision is for a project and advocate for that.
Yeah. And also try to make lemonade out of lemons. Someone had asked a question, like, how do you determine what to cut? Well, that was significant for me, because my outlines, I've been working on these outlines for 10 years. When I sit down to write, there's a good chance I've been working on that outline scene by scene, literally scene by years. And at the last second, when they say you've got to cut 50 pages of what you're preparing to do, because I know how long it's going to be, that was catastrophic. I went into a tailspin when that happened, because that outline's been so fixed in my head for so long, I don't even know how to remove a brick from it, let alone an entire floor. But it turned out to be an opportunity, because I looked at what needed to get removed from book 3, and it became a whole new series. It became the birth of a series I call the Magnus Academy series, which focuses on the teenagers and the younger people in my universe, with the goal of writing a magical boarding school novel. That's been one of my dreams forever. I'm reading Sholomance right now, and I just love that genre so much. I just absolutely love magical boarding schools. And now I've got the characters to do it. And, holy crap, my publisher gave me the idea by cutting 100 pages and me taking that 100 pages, making a 200-page novella and starting a new series. Maybe it'll work out better in that way, but I learned the hard way: get on the same page as your publisher early in the process and not later.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think we're at time now. So if we don't have any more questions coming in, K.D, thank you so much for hopping on and being part of this discussion. And let's just do a book plug. The book is Silk Fire by Zabé Ellor, and Candace is going to do a plug for it. And you can go ahead and buy these. K.D, you want to do your book plug?
Yeah, my first book is called The Last Sun. The series is the Tarot Sequence. My third book, the first trilogy, is done, and I'm moving into my next trilogy, and a novella that's an expansion of the third book comes out in 28 days.
And you can purchase those books at the link that I have pinned in the chat. So it should be right there at the top of your list, and you can, of the chat, sorry, and you can just click the link and you can buy either or both of these books from Tubby Coos Mid-City Bookshop. Here in New Orleans, we are the only queer-owned bookstore in New Orleans, which a lot of people are surprised when they hear that, but it's true, as of right now anyway. So thank y'all so much for having this conversation. It was really, really great, and y'all had some really good answers to the questions, and folks were really positive in the chat about everything that y'all were doing, and there were thank yous there. So I would go back and scroll through and see all of the thank yous in the chat for y'all. So thank you so much for doing this today. And everyone, whether you're watching now or time traveling in the future and watching, buy books always from your indie bookstores or from bookshop.org, which supports indie bookstores. Either way, support your indies. and especially your queer-owned indies. And thank you all so much for approaching me to have this conversation. It was really great.
Thanks, Candace.
Thank you so much for hosting, Candace, and take care.
Of course. Thanks everyone for watching.
Bye.